Have you ever drafted your own pattern and wonder, what do I sew first? In this video, I'll walk you through the order of construction I use to sew my garments from start to finish. You can use this process on tops, dresses, skirts, jackets, and coats. Let's jump in. Before starting to sew, I do 4 things. First, I obviously cut out all the pattern pieces. I carefully mark each one with all the notches. I indicate where the darts are. I also indicate the wrong side. If the right and wrong side are very similar in look, I might put a little check mark in chalk. I might also want to identify which ones are the front pieces or the back pieces if they look very similar. Next, I'm going to add any interfacing to areas that I want a little bit more stability. So I'll add areas of interfacing in areas such as a collar or a facing or around a zipper. So for this fabric is quite stable that I'm using today, so I'm not going to be adding interfacing. Third, I'm going to stay stitch any areas that are very curved, such as the neckline or an armhole. And the stay stitching provides stability so it doesn't stretch out while you're sewing. And you can look at this video here that I talk all about stay stitching in detail. And the last thing I do is potentially sew around the perimeter with a either serger or a zigzag stitch. I do this if the fabric frays a lot, but my fabric that I'm using today does not fray, and also my garment's going to be fully lined, so you will not see those inside edges if I just wanted to finish them off very cleanly, but I do not, and I'd prefer not to have the added bulk with the serge lines. The basic flow of the order of construction is starting on the inside of the garment and then working towards the perimeter. The inside of the garment are things like darts and style lines. Style lines would be things like princess seams or a yoke, so you would sew those first. These help you with the overall fit of the garment and the structure of the garment. Once all of those inside elements are put together, then you're going to work out towards the perimeter, sewing things like your shoulder seams, your side seams, and finally you're going to end with hem and closure. So now I'll get into more detail of the exact order that I follow as I go through. Some of these steps I don't do every single time. I just jump over them because the garment that I'm making doesn't require them. But I'll list them all just so you're aware in case your garment does. In between each step is press your garment. It's very important to press those seams. It makes a much more professional look in the final product. And you want to fit often. So when you add certain pieces together, hold it up to you or put on the garment and make sure that it all fits so you don't find out at the end that something's not working. I always start with darts as they define the fit of the garment. I converted most of my darts in this dress into princess seams, so I only have these side darts. I sewed them, you can see the back here and the front, and then I gave them a press. And I also put darts in the lining pieces as well. So next we sew the style lines. Style lines include things such as princess seams, which I have in this dress. They could also be a yoke or any kind of seam you have just simply for design aesthetic. You could have asymmetrical seams in your garment. So it's so much easier to sew these seams when everything's flat. And also it gives structure to the overall shape of the garment. You can see now the dress shape. So it makes it much easier once we start putting the rest together to make sure everything is aligned. And you're going to add the zippers now, unless you have a zipper that goes over a seam. Like perhaps you have a dress that the zipper goes from the neckline down past the waist. So then you would wait till a later point to add that zipper. But if the zipper does not go past a seam line, you should add it now. There's a few reasons that it's important to add the zipper at this stage, is because it's much easier to install it when you have a flat piece of fabric. You also can make sure that the alignment is good at this point. It prevents fabric distortion, and you can give it a fit at this point and make sure that you're happy with that. The correct time to sew center back or center front seams is after you've sewn your darts and your star lines, but before you sew your side seams or adding your sleeves. This ensures that the fit and structure of the garment are already established and makes for a really good fit. Sewing the waist seam before the shoulder seam helps ensure that you have a very good fit at the waist. And if you have a zipper that extends below the waist seam, you should add it now. I don't have a center front or center back seam, and I don't have a waist seam, so I'm going to skip these steps. I also don't have pockets, but if you do, you should add them now because it's much easier to install them when the fabric is still flat. Now we're moving on to the perimeter of the garment. You can see that I sewed both of the shoulder seams and pressed the seam allowance open. Sewing the shoulder seams at this point simplifies adding sleeves. It ensures a clean finish for the neckline also. We do this to the outer fabric, which I did here, and also the lining, or if you're using a facing. If you have a collar, you would prepare the collar at this point. I don't have one, so I'm going to skip this step. Then I'm going to move on to the sleeve. You want to prepare the sleeve as well. I have sewn the underarm seam, and as well as the dart from earlier, you can see here if you have a dart in your sleeve. Then I also serged my seam line because I will not line the sleeve, so I would just like to have a clean finish on the inside of the sleeve. Since this fabric has a slight stretch to it, I am not going to gather the sleeve cap, but if you're using a fully woven fabric, you should do a basting stitch here so you can gather that in a little bit to fit into your sleeve cap. So I sewed the neckline the entire way around. The outer fabric I sewed to the lining fabric. Then I just clipped the entire way around, which allows the seam to lie flat without puckering when you turn it right sides out, so around these curves. The next step that I'm going to do is understitching, which is when I turn it right side out, I'm going to sew the seam allowance to the lining. You can see a video here how I go into it in detail. I just finished sewing the side seams of the entire dress, including the lining inside as well. I did the side seam for that. And the next step is going to be, I'm going to baste the lining to the outer fabric, just the whole way around the arm. The reason I do that is I just want to make them into one piece because then I'll be attaching the sleeve after that. I just find it's easier if I give it a baste inside the seam line, then it's not moving around while I'm adding the sleeve, so everything will be aligned quite nicely. So the sleeve will be next after that. To the last step, I added the sleeves in here. They're inset sleeves, and I finished them off. I serged them so they had a nice clean finish inside. And finally, I'm going to hem the dress. I'm going to use just a 1/2 inch hem turned twice. You can hem in a variety of ways. That's what I'm going to do with this one, and I have no other closures. I like to make the neckline large enough so I can just slip it over. It just makes getting dressed so much easier. So I'll skip the closure step as well. And lastly, we make sure we press the entire garment. We remember we have pressed throughout each step, but then we're going to give it one final press at the end. I try to follow this order of operations, and sometimes we forget and we do the steps in the wrong order. And that usually causes a lot of problems that we have to start getting the seam ripper out. So I like to try to follow this order of operations so I don't have a problem down the road. There's certain things that you can switch a little bit here and there, like the collar preparation, you could move to the very beginning if you want. The waist seam is going to be a matter of the garment you have, so that does shift around a little bit. But most of the order is in pretty standard place that you want to follow each time. If your fabric frays, it's important to finish those seams. Either use a serger or a zigzag stitch. Even if it's completely lined, you don't want all of that fraying inside the lining. So you definitely want to do a seam finish in some way. You can do a French seam also, which is, beautiful inside and out. And the last thing I do is after I'm completed, I put any notes of things that I'd like to change or problems that I uncovered. I'll put that on the pattern. So next time I make that pattern, I'll have those, and they're so useful to have. If you want to learn more how I made this pattern for this red dress, check out the video here. I'd so appreciate it if you would like and subscribe. I'm a new channel and it helps so much.